Hello and a warm welcome to the Irish Angle on Jump to It. As usual, I've Johnny Ward and Emma Nagle here, and we're going to discuss all the things that happened last week in horse racing, mainly the Guineas, I would imagine. Johnny, Emma, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vinny.
Thanks, Vincent.
Now, start off with, first of all, 2000 Guineas, Saturday, Chaldine, well backed on the day, 7-1 into 7-2 with Frankie Dettori. It was always going to be Frankie Dettori, wasn't it? His final season, the farewell tour, and the flying dismounts. It was a terrific performance in the end. What did you make of it, Emma?
Yeah, no, it was brilliant. Frankie, was it his fourth and his final Guineas? In fairness, I think with all the talk around the O'Brien horses coming in, Chaldine was probably a bit underrated coming into it. Obviously, he didn't have the ideal prep when he unshipped Frankie a couple of weeks ago at Newbury, but you know, he was a very good 2-year-old, and I think it looks like he's after coming on again as a 3-year-old, and he's kind of a horse you can kind of get behind. You know, he could be one of the last very good horses that Frankie rides if he keeps going on the same trajectory. And I think it's kind of to note as well that he's by Frankel, and I think he is the horse that completes the Triple Crown for Frankel in terms of breeding classic winners. He's now sired the winners of the St. Leger Derby and the Guineas, which is some feat in fairness, and he looks a very worthy successor of his sire. But yeah, he's just a horse you can really get behind. The showmanship of Frankie, the legendary sire, and yeah, it's just a great story, and he's one that I'm looking forward to following for the year. Where they'll go next, I'm not sure. I think they said they might give the Irish Guineas a skip and head straight to Ascot, which is no massive surprise, I suppose, but probably a bit of a pity for Irish racegoers. I'm sure we all would love to see Frankie over if they did go that direction. But yeah, no, he looks a real good one.
Yeah, and the other thing there to note is you talk about the Triple Crown. Aidan O'Brien was talking up the Triple Crown before the Guineas with Augustus Rodin. And he also had Little Big Bear. They finished 12th and 14th. Very disappointing. What do you make of that, Johnny?
Very disappointing, Vinny. I thought it was a very big race, really, for Coolmore in the sense of where it's going as an operation post Galileo, effectively. I was at Aidan's last year, and I guess quite a few of us heard him talk about Augusto Rodin. He's a son of Deep Impact, and he essentially spoke of him as give or take as good a horse as they trained. And he looked like he was going to make into a very good stallion this year, which he may well still do, because the fact that he's by Deep Impact, he's out of Rhododendron as well, and how good he was at Doncaster when we last saw him. And that performance to me suggested that he was going to be a Derby horse. I never had him as a Guineas horse this year in general. And I suppose a bit like St. Nicholas Abbey when he ran in the Guineas. He lost the race and he was a short price, but you didn't feel like that was that much of a disappointment in the sense that he didn't really have the speed to go with him. This was different though. The ground should have come right for him. He was sent off 13-8 favourite, presumably because it did get quite testing. It was soft ground, and they were finishing quite well strung out, particularly in the 1000 Guineas. So things came right for him, and I'm not sure what happened. It was a desperate performance. Ryan Moore was, even by his standards, was quite taciturn after the race. I think his reply in the sense of how did your horse do was ask the trainer, which is 3 words. What's that, 4 syllables? So Ryan would be proud of that, but there might be something to that as well. I don't know if Emma would agree in the sense that, Ryan can be quiet after a race, but, I think he was probably like, well, this is nothing to do with me. Maybe there's an issue here. And Little Big Bear for me, I thought it was a big weekend for No Nay Never as well, Vinny, who to my mind, he hasn't had a classic winner yet. 10 Sovereigns has been doing quite well as his son is a stallion this year with his 2-year-olds. And Aidan obviously had 2 well-touted horses. I know Little Big Bear was relatively weak in the market. He did go off 5-1. But for me, the soft ground was offered up as an excuse, I think, at the Racing Post. I don't think that was an issue at all, because when he was, his performances... that was offered as an excuse for Meditate. For Little Big Bear, Stamina was offered as the excuse, and maybe that's the case, but for me, he was almost beaten before Stamina became an issue. I see subsequently they said he was lame on one of his hinds, so maybe he's going to drop back sort of for the Commonwealth Cup or something like that. But considering Aidan hasn't had a great run of it in the Guineas, the loss of Galileo as a stallion going forward, and the fact that if you look at the anti-post markets now for both the Irish Guineas and the other other classics. Aidan isn't actually that strong. I think it's interesting times where we talk about jumps racing being too concentrated in terms of one trainer. That's not the case anymore in flat racing in Ireland or Britain. I think Aidan O'Brien's kind of stranglehold is definitely under a bit of pressure at the moment.
Yeah, he certainly. You talk about Meditate as well in the 1,000 Guineas. That's another one there. Emma Maj won it for side Bin Sarur, Rusheen Murphy. The Weld horse ran a cracker. She ran an absolute stormer. And maybe if Chris Hayes, in hindsight, didn't have her as close to the other rival in the closing stages, she may have won. I think she got worried out of it a tiny bit in the finish, but a cracking performance. They finished a long way clear. They're obviously two very good fillies. But Meditate again. Maybe it was the ground. It's hard to know. It had gone pretty soft by Sunday. What did you make of that race, Emma?
Yeah, look, I don't think too many would have picked out Maj as the winner coming into it. But in fairness, I think it was probably a combination of a power packed ride by Oisin and a very, very game filly. She really stuck her neck out when Dermot Wells filly came to her. But like in fairness, I think if you were on the favour, she'd probably be a small bit sick. She did travel into it like the winner, but she just wasn't able to get past the Godolphin filly in the end. I think Dermot Wells was saying kind of coming into it that he didn't have her 100%. And I'd say if they met again in a few weeks' time, the result probably would be the other way around. You'd have to think the ground probably wasn't totally in her favour when she wasn't completely wound up. But she'll go on from here, and I'm sure she'll fulfill all her potential later on in the year. If they'll meet again in the Irish Guineas, is not 100% sure. I think they were kind of leaning towards going there with the Godolphin filly, but I think Dermot Wells said that he thought Tahira had quite a hard race, so he might give it a skip. But it'll be interesting to see if they do turn up, because in fairness, they put on some show in Newmarket, putting I think 7 or 8 lengths clear of the third horse. Very exciting race, and Oisin Murphy might be the successor to Frankie Dettori's public appeal. We saw him after the race pumping up the crowd, and in fairness, it's been some redemption arc for him in the past few months, coming back off a long ban, but he's really turning it around, and you'd have to say he's probably one of the best riders in the world at the moment.
Yeah, another thing to note out of that was Matilda Picot finishing third as well. Was a great run. Another Irish filly that got into the place at a big price, 33-1. Just on the jockeys that won the two big races, Johnny, what do you make of that? You've got Frankie Dettori does the flying dismount. Fantastic for the sport. Real character, always has been. He's in his swan song now. Last season, he'll be gone. We've Oisin Murphy, who's obviously come back from all sorts of horrors in his career, but he's a great character too. He's terrific with the media. He's terrific with the public. What about that going forward? Is that an important aspect to the sport, or are we happy enough with the Ryan Moores of this world who say as little as possible and avoid the media spotlight where possible?
No, I think I like a bit of variety as well. I think Ryan isn't compelled to put on a show. He does his job. He rides very well. Very, very clean record off the track as well. You got to remember that Frankie Dettori and particularly Oisin Murphy have had their in terms of disciplinary issues. They've made mistakes, and you can say what you like about Ryan Moore, but he lives a very good life, and he's a great ambassador for the sport. For me, he's not a natural. I suppose, he's not the most gregarious character in the world, but that's him. And I've spent time in Ryan's company doing a couple of interviews. Really, really like him, really like the family. I don't think he's the type to kind of engage in what Oisin Murphy did after the race, but we had great results because it's obviously Frankie's swan song. And then you had the whole Oisin Murphy story of how it is redemption for him. And, I think, Oisin has shown himself to be very savvy with the media for a guy who, I suppose he doesn't sound the most excitable character in the world, but some of his stuff on social media is very good. I do agree with you, Vinny. I think, if you look at some of the sports that are struggling at the moment, I look at Premiership rugby in Britain. The clubs are losing 4 million a year. You look at other sports where crowds are down a bit. Racing can't rely on its reputation forever, and we do need to promote ourselves in social media. And I think it's important that the jockeys do all that. But at the same time, Ryan Moore is Ryan Moore. So I'm not necessarily sure that you can force something that he doesn't want to do. I do think it was a good result for racing, the two jockeys winning. On the race itself, I think going forward, Tahira's performance, considering how much pedigree is on the dam side for a step up to a mile and a half, and the contrasting profiles of the two horses, one so battle-hardened and taking on a filly that had literally run a couple of times, was coming in on a seasonal debut. Dermot Well didn't have a winner at all this season, I think, until Saturday. His horse was only just coming into form. Thought it was a phenomenal performance, and I'm kind of happy that Dermot at this stage of his career has a horse who looks very, very good. Like, if she stays a mile and a half, she could be exceptional. The one caveat in the race was the fact that you've 102.99 and 104 third, fourth and fifth respectively, for all there was a great result for Kieran Cotter.
Yeah, well, it's a great result for him, no doubt about it. He's a man going places too, isn't he? He's done very well the last couple of seasons. The other one then, the Kentucky Derby, was on at the weekend. We nearly had the same name winner of that as we had for the 1,000 Guineas. We had Maj and Maj. Maj won at 15-1, only the third start for that horse. Venezuelan connections, as in the trainer and the jockey. One thing to note there out of Churchill Downs was that there were 7 fatalities over the week's racing in Churchill Downs. Like it keeps coming back up, doesn't it? The issues that horse racing has as a sport, whether it's the whip or it's the fatalities or it's whatever, about it, all sorts of anti-protests and everything else, which again, there was an incident at Doncaster over the weekend where there were some protesters there. It's not going away. I don't know much about the details of the fatalities at Churchill Downs, but American racing does seem to be very hard on horses, historically anyway, with all the different drugs they put into them as well, which are legal in some areas such as the Butte. What do you make of that, Emma? You didn't watch the whole programme, did you? The Kentucky Derby?
No, I just saw a replay of it, but I think one thing that the Americans do brilliantly, whether it's flat or jumps racing, their marketing of the sport, they put on a real show. The coverage of the racing is kind of just draws you in, and I enjoy watching it. I didn't watch the whole lot of it on Saturday night. I wasn't at home to see the whole thing, but I saw some replays, and I think they're great. I think they had Patrick Mahomes, the NFL quarterback, doing the riders up before it, and all. Kind of having those kind of celebrities at it, I suppose it draws in kind of people. Let's say if Ronaldo was at the Epsom Derby telling the jockeys to leg up, it's going to draw new eyes into it. So I think they do that well. The marketing, the Americans, in fairness, they know how to draw on the audience, I think.
Yeah, one thing I find fascinating. Sorry, go ahead, Johnny. Yeah.
Sorry, I think whatever about Cheltenham, where like I was disgusted with the BBC for. I remember being in Cheltenham a couple of years ago and disgusted with the BBC, and the biggest day for our sport that they were leading on Cheltenham trying to cut down on equine fatalities. But that's what you're up against in the mainstream media. Whatever about Cheltenham, where obviously they've tinkered with this and that. They've tinkered with the National Chase. They've tinkered with the Grand National. You do expect fatalities when horses are jumping at speed. I mean, that's kind of part of the agreement we enter in the sport. To have 7 fatalities leading up to the Kentucky Derby, added to the disgraceful situation that some of the top trainers have gotten in there with drugs, and with the really, really precarious position that American racing is in terms of crowds and the need for casinos, the loss of racetracks over there. This is really damaging for the sport. And I do think, I'm looking at NPR leading with 7 fatalities. It's entirely rational, and if you're a fan of American racing at the moment, I think you're very, very worried, and by extension, you have to be a little bit worried over here as well.
Yeah, one thing I do have to take from the American side of it is, which Emma mentioned there, is the way they cover it on TV is fantastic. At those big events like the Kentucky Derby, you get the backstory on the horse, you get the backstory on the trainer, the owner, the jockey. They go through everything, and it's fascinating to hear some of the backstories behind some of these, how they got to be there. We don't quite get that, or we don't quite portray that in the same way with whether it's Cheltenham, Aintree, Punchestown, any of the festivals here, any of the big racing on the flat either. You get little bits of it, admittedly, but very little. I think there should be a greater focus on that. There must be fabulous stories. We all know fabulous stories within racing, but such as your Hewicks and, for the 850 quid or whatever and all that sort of thing. But generally there's a story about every one of these horses, and we don't quite get the story every time. We kind of expect people to know the backstory a lot of the time rather than really pushing it, which I think is something for the future of the sport, because they say we're struggling to get bums on seats a lot of the time, or to get eyeballs on the TV when horse racing's on, as we see with the Derby having to switch its time now at Epsom to not form a clash with the FA Cup final. It just goes to show the position horse racing is in, and it's going to get into a more precarious position, I'd say, as years go on, which is why we're talking about the fact of showmanship of jockeys, whether that's something that's needed or whatever. But there's great stories within the sport, and I think we just need to get those stories out there myself. Anyway, moving on to other racing from the week. Johnny, you were talking to me earlier about Ronan McNally landed a bit of a touch in Downpatrick on Friday with Full Noise.
He did, and I suppose it's one of the quirks of the system that, I mean, Ronan is on the cusp. We'll talk about David Dunn. Ronan is on the cusp of, a staggering sentence, really, of 12 years. Yes, obviously you can appeal and sort of continue on, and some of his horses have been running well. I was doing an analysis for the race and post on the race, and it's kind of a strange one, Vinny, because the horse's form had been so poor over fences, like so poor. Yet Connections are still kind of happy to send him to a race in which his chance wouldn't be obvious on paper. Hammer him in the betting. Somebody hammer him in the betting anyway into odds on. And you're watching the race, and Keith Donoghue is coming to the last two fences, and he literally just, they come up quickly in Downpatrick, the last two. So he's just thinking, all I need to do is negotiate these two, and the horse had kind of gone clear in front of him. I texted Ronan after the race, and he said, his jumping was poor. He's a big horse. He's very, very raw. And you're kind of thinking, like, on the one level, Ronan's and Connections have seemingly landed a gamble here at Downpatrick. And on the other hand, he's going to be banned forever from the sport, effectively, when the appeal is heard. And it must be a strange time for him, but he's certainly still able to pull them off anyway.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens at his appeal. It's due up at the end of this month. It was, obviously, he was supposed to have his licence taken away early March prior to Cheltenham, but because of the appeal, it's still going on. I think by the time they get everyone together into the one room to hear it, it's going to be at the end of this month. I think it's 2 days are penciled in for towards the end of May. What's interesting, we see what happens in there, because one of the people out of that particular case against Ronan McNally was the other trainer, David Dunn, who we found out last week that he had appealed. He'd appealed against the severity of his sanction, which was they basically gave him a 2-year suspension of his licence, but the last 18 months were suspended. So realistically, he got a 6-month ban and a €5,000 fine. So he'd appealed the severity of that. But unfortunately, at his appeal, he couldn't afford legal representation. So he had to represent himself. So you can imagine that for anyone. It's difficult enough to speak in public oftentimes or whatever else, but to have to stand up and make a case for yourself in a legal situation, which is basically a courtroom, against barristers and other senior counsels on the other side of the fence against you. He got nowhere at that, absolutely nowhere. And most of the things he tried to bring up at it, they were saying were inadmissible because he was only appealing the severity, and he was trying to then appeal against some of the sanctions that were made against him, the findings at the original hearing. So they weren't admissible in the particular appeal hearing. So he gets nowhere. Just in racing, is that a bit unfair that he's not allowed to get free legal representation? Because it is his livelihood, after all, that's been taken away. Whether that's right or wrong is not the point. It's the fact that you've got a trainer here who can't afford to get proper legal representation. And that was definitely his downfall at this. What do you think, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem incredibly fair. I mean, if he was a man with more resources, maybe if he was training as a hobby and he had a big business behind him, he probably would be in a totally different position if he had maybe better legal support behind him. So yeah, it doesn't seem fair at all, and there's really not a whole pile you can say about it other than you'd have to feel for him. Just the fact that, and the €2,000 on top of that for the legal costs kind of seems to be a bit even a slap in the face on top of it all. Yeah, you'd have to feel sorry for him really hearing about it.
Yeah, he's a man who couldn't afford his own legal counsel. Sorry, Johnny. Just saying he couldn't afford his own legal counsel. Right, here you go. Go on, you talk.
Sorry, Vinny. It's worth recalling back in, I'm sure you remember the Foxrock case, because that comes to mind partly because of the differences of being able to kind of, have yourself represented well. And obviously the fact that Ted Walsh has just kind of, he's announced his retirement from RTE, but Ted Walsh in that Foxrock case, which I think was pretty unforgettable and one of the most bizarre cases for me that I've ever seen come across. He was represented by Michael McDowell, and you'll remember some of the character references he got. Compare that to where David Dunn was.
Yeah. Aidan O'Brien and Willie Mullins were two that were character references for Ted, and also said that the issue with the shoes could happen on a gallop. So yeah, David Dunn could have done with a few of them in his corner, I suppose, but that wasn't to be the case. So he's going to serve his 6 months, pay his $5,000 plus his $2,000. They gave him an extra $2,000, which he had to pay towards the IHRB's legal costs, which seems a bit ironic considering he couldn't afford his own. But there you are. He'll move on. He's only a young man. I'm sure he'll be back at some point, and let's hope he keeps clean the next time and there's no more messing with who owns the horses and all the rest of it. But we'll see what happens with Ronan McNally. I presume he will have legal representation. You'd imagine he's a few quid. He has his own business on the side. So I'd like to think he'll have someone representing him, because if he goes in the same way, he's going to come out with a similar outcome, I'd imagine. Moving on then, just anything else from last week? Have you a horse for us to follow from what you saw over the weekend or somewhere last week? Johnny, you always have an odd one for me.
I'll go with him as first, actually. Just have to look up the name of mine here.
All right, Emma, you throw your one in if you have it.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Spreewell for Jessica Harrington. He won the Derby trial at Leopardstown yesterday, and I think it was just noticeable when we were at Jessie's a few weeks ago. She put forward the Derby as the one race she'd love to win, and this fella, he was very impressive. He beat a good horse of Donica's and a horse of Joseph's as well. Donica's horse was second in the Vincent O'Brien Stakes last year, so I don't think it was bad for him, and he won it going away as well. Like, he's not in the English Derby yet, but I think they're probably talking about supplementing him now, and he's been supporting the market as well. I think he was introduced at around 50 to 1. He's down at around 16 to 1 now. So yeah, I'd like to see him run well in the Derby, and he really impressed me yesterday. So he'll be one I'm following anyway for the next few weeks.
Yeah, Jessica's horses have started the flat season on the front foot anyway. Lots of winners, all running well. Just one other thing I'm going to say there, which I forgot to mention earlier, was a race I saw in Leopardstown. The last race in Leopardstown on Sunday, I thought it was pretty meritorious. Paddy Harnett, he lost lost 1 iron with about a furlong and a half to run, kicked the other one out, and got up on the line to win a nose in a photo finish, which I thought was a great riding performance. It was actually a 1-2 for Donnacha O'Brien, which is somewhat unusual, I would have thought. The other thing to note out of that was I'd watched the race on TV, and it looked clear on the television that Amusement had got up with Paddy Harnett, but yet they went 1-3 in the photo, which looked great value. I think people might have thought there might have been a Stewart's inquiry because the horse had leaned in a little bit, but there wasn't as such, and all things stayed as they were. 1-3 is probably the best photo finish price you'll see for a long time. Johnny, what have you got your horse? You found it?
Yeah, the only thing about that, Vinny, is you see that sometimes with photo finishes, and you just got to be careful with potential interference. And I actually quite like betting on inquiries and sometimes photo finishes, but that's the caveat. I think that's the sort of stuff that if we had proper video on, like, you could show I don't think we really show the skills that jockeys actually managing races, stuff like that, like Paddy Harton. I tipped that horse up. Looked like she was all over the winner basically for nearly the whole race, and then obviously the issue with the irons, but that's the sort of thing that we need to promote more on social media. I give up Timeless Peace, I think, as a horse recently. That horse was scratched at the weekend, and then was declared at Gore and went from 2 to 1, Vinny, out to 6 to 1. And I was at my auntie's funeral, and the wake was from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and the race was at 7:10, and I wasn't backing it at sort of the 2 to 1 price, so I wasn't like going to be checking my phone during the wake to see what prices went off. But the odd person that came in, my brother-in-law would say, "Oh, he's into the horses now. We'll give him that tip." So there were a few people, and my auntie was certainly a name that would go well with Timeless Peace. But I tipped it to a few people, and I couldn't believe it went off 6 to 1. And I think Timeless Peace is a filly to follow once she steps up and trip for Jessie, who, as you mentioned, is in great form. It wasn't a great weekend for Aidan O'Brien at all. I think he was 2 from 18 on Saturday and Sunday. But Ger Lyons, who's had a very sluggish start to the season, he unveiled a nice horse, I thought, on Saturday, Mr. Saturday. He's a horse by Blue Point. He doesn't have the most flashy pedigree, but I thought he ran a really, really nice race first time out. He was beaten by Devious, who looks a lovely horse for Donicha, won first time out. But Mr. Saturday come up the near side of the track, really flashed home, looked all over the place kind of mentally, and Gers normally would be sharp enough first time. I think this horse has plenty more in him, and I think he's going to have a lovely campaign. It'll be interesting to see, and Gers clicking into form as well, as DK did at the weekend.
Yeah, that's the man that I'm going to pick one of, is DK Weld, a filly called Gillida. ran in the second last race in Leopardstown at the weekend. Colin Keane rode. This was already twice a winner, this filly, at Leopardstown. It won 3 times last season, had a nice comeback run, I think it was in Cork. And then it was running over 1.25 miles, which the trip might have just about been too far, particularly on soft to heavy ground. Came there cruising, turning in, looked all over a winner. But then there was another one, caught a tartar on the outside, a Slattery horse, Andy Slattery and Andy Slattery, 2 of them together, father and son. They came up and with a wet sail on the outside to win. But I thought Colin Keane minded that filly. Once he knew the race was over, he wasn't going to win. He eased up in the last 100 yards, gave her a nice little run out. I think she'll win again. I think she's still very well handicapped, so she'd be one to look out for. So that's it for this week. Listen, thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll join us again next week, and maybe you'll subscribe to our channel to get notifications of when these videos are coming out. So you'll see the subscribe button below if you're watching this on YouTube. And we'll see you all again next week. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.